Okay. Yeah, Losang, thank you. Thank you so much for taking this time to come here and speak to us. And there's so much we have about. There's so much that we'll be covering on Tibetan and Mahayana Buddhism. What are some of the gifts of the philosophy that we can all use in our everyday lives? And I think most importantly, I think we would love to learn about you and your journey and what brought you here in this robe. So let's get started with Jonathan Owen
Yeah.
in New England.
Okay. Well, to be honest, there's not much of a story, really. The main story is how this philosophy of the Nalanda tradition, right, the Buddhist Nalanda tradition, is beneficial in your daily life. And just my coming to recognize that by being fortunate enough to just come into contact with the tradition, the teachings, the amazing teachers who embody it, and then trying out their advice. And then recognizing, hey, this is making my life better. It's allowing me to see other people in a kinder light with more respect, gratitude, as peers, as siblings, even as family, as the same as myself, right? Seeing what we call usually the sort of Buddhist word, we use equanimity, seeing people as being equals, right? Yeah, that was just so powerful that I realized, well, the great masters who practiced and really evolved their minds through the tradition of the Nalanda masters, they really used these methods and they worked for them, right? They worked to transform their minds. In other words, the Buddhist teaching is very practical. It's practical psychology. It's something that helps you change your mind, your thinking, and thus how you feel, right? Your emotions. But otherwise, yeah, Jonathan Owen, he was a regular dumb kid growing up in New England, like any other, happened to, take a yoga class in high school, which was the initial experience of just, frankly, anything that wasn't just externally focused. The first time of actually just taking a few moments, and then the entire life up to, this was at the age 15, I think, sophomore in high school, right? First time in my entire life where I actually noticed, oh, I have a mind. There is something, another aspect of this human existence that is not just some kind of external person, sensation, object, possession, status, etc., right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so that made you want to go deeper.
That made me want to go deeper, yeah.
Right.
So I did first a little bit into Hindu philosophy or other Indian schools, not in that much detail, and I wasn't that mature yet, but what I read did continue to interest me. But then eventually I just happened to get a suggestion from my brother actually to look into Buddhist teachings. So I just started looking into it, going to the library, Googling, and
Amazing.
realized that
So
it made so much sense.
you were all alone, motivated to dig deeper into Eastern philosophies. You were going to the library researching. You had a little breadcrumb from your brother to look into Buddhism, and no real support structure in New England, or
Well, so then after I started reading some books and I Googled and I found there was a center only 15 minutes from where I was living where there was a great teacher. A Geshe is the word that is like an academic title for someone who's gone through this roughly 20-year study program that the Tibetan tradition specializes in. And he was just living there giving classes and doing prayers or meditations a few times a week. So I was able to just go. It was very close. And he was really one of the great masters. He had come from Tibet itself. He was born in the mid-30s, went into exile in 1959 along with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Studied very, very well. Was one of the, kind of the top scholar in his class and his cohort, and eventually was appointed abbot of the Namgyal Monastery, which is here in Dharamsala. Right, it's part of like the main temple, the Tuglakhang, in McLeod-Ganj. So he was there for some years. He taught actually some of the first nuns who ever became geshes, because until just 2016, a few years ago, only monks were able to get this academic degree and do the associated studies. So he was one of the teachers that taught the first class of the nuns who were doing the same studies, and then eventually retired to the US and moved to Connecticut.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah.
So what I'm hearing is that you're a young teen that came across these teachings that really resonated with you. They were new, they felt right, and you also happened to come across a Geshe that was easily accessible, that brought you these concepts that really opened up a few light bulbs that resonated with you.
Right, and then just his example is what I realized is what made me realize that this is how I need to live if I want to achieve the same state that he's achieved. In other words, become a monk and do the same study program that he did.
Aha, okay. So then you were quite set about becoming a monk by then.
Yeah, I even, wanted to just leave, not finishing high school and go directly to India.
Wow.
But
That is
luckily,
not typical at all.
My mother did not allow me to do that because that would have been a disaster.
Yeah.
I can see. But either way, yeah, my interest was there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interest was there.
Did it feel like it was filling any gaps that you had in your life living in the US? Was there something there that it was doing for you? That
Right. Well, there's definitely, yes, I can say. And then there's two ways of looking at what that gap might be. One's a more philosophical way, and then the other is just sort of emotional, right?
Yeah.
So the emotional side of it is just that, frankly, the mind was dull. There was a lot of sadness, frustration, loneliness. I mean, frustration that created loneliness. In other words, it's not like there was a lack of friends around. Right. It was a lack of an ability to connect with them in a harmonious and joyful way because my mind was just completely controlled by these projections that make people, seem like enemies when really they're friends. In other words, just a kind of irritation for no reason, just this kind of habit of negative energy in the mind that's just gets irritated. Oh, you turned the music on too loud. Oh, you're so bad. Oh, you're not, you changed the channel when I was watching, the things a kid thinks, right? Oh, I wanted to play the video game and you took the control. It's
emotional upheaval.
Yeah, just constant negative emotions, right?
Yes.
And so what was missing emotionally was a sense of stability, of calm, peace of mind, you can say, right?
Yeah.
And then just a kind of basic sense of loving respect, right? Caring respect for others, which is really the bedrock of human civilization and society. I mean, you see politically, there's so much anger in the world and probably every country, certainly India, certainly the US. And part of the reason for that is because people don't have the basic sense of caring respect for our fellow citizens, right? As country people, as fellow countrymen. But then, leaving aside politics, just in every relationship you have in your daily life, whether you're going to, the post office and mailing a package and dealing with the person there or at the store, the checkout line, or your friends, your peers, your teachers, your boss, your, under workers, whatever, your employees. And philosophically, I think one of the ways that we could talk about that missing peace of mind is actually comes from or is completely linked with a lack of understanding about the mind itself.
Yeah.
In other words, a misidentification of what our minds are or what consciousness is. Mind and consciousness being used interchangeably in the Buddhist psychology and philosophical tradition. In other words, because we're so outwardly focused, right?
Yeah.
And focused on physical realities, right? Well, we have a materialist, physicalist view of reality, which means everything that exists is material, is physical. Every conscious experience we have, emotional experience we have, cognitions, perceptions, etc., they're brain states, or they are the brain, or they are somehow found within the brain. Could be found within the brain if we just kept looking for a few more years. Still haven't found much in that regard. Of course, neuroscience has made amazing progression, and there's so many valuable aspects of what the discoveries have enabled. Of course, medical treatment being one of the most powerful, and now leading into different insights and sort of new approaches towards computation, computing, AI, etc. A lot of that does come from scientific exploration of the mind. But the point that I'm making here is that the mind itself, right, and this can be explored scientifically in the sense of using a sort of radical empirical lens, which means looking directly at your experience through your, what's immediately available to you in your experience as a given subject, right? What's given to us is the actual clarity and awareness of the mind. Clarity and awareness of the mind, that's what we mean when we talk about consciousness. It's not the brain states. They are connected. They are related, right? Doesn't mean they're one. So the sense or belief that they're one, what does it do? It makes it so that people, frankly, neglect their minds. So that's the philosophical thing that's missing, the neglect of the mind.
So we have our brain processes and our mind processes, and understanding that there is a separation allows us to function out of, for example, our mind state, which is our experience of the world. And how has your practices, or how has Tibetan Buddhism helped you zone in on the mind? How has Tibetan Buddhism helped you zone in on the mind and improve the experience of, or the quality of your experience?
So then taking that first step as the foundational move, right? It's basically a philosophical move we have to make. Where we, instead of like sitting there thinking, oh, I'm getting angry because my brain is throwing up, this hormone, that hormone, whatever. My pituitary gland is flaring up. I'm angry. So instead of that, you actually develop, again, closer familiarity with your own direct mental states. It's called the practice of mindfulness of mind, essentially, right? There's other ways of describing it. That's one way, the mindfulness of mind. And then you get to see the anger. Oh, this is what anger looks like. I'm projecting this kind of qualities onto that person, seeing them as 100% negative just because they said one word that I didn't agree with, and I felt embarrassed, or I felt like I was being overlooked or disrespected. And so now I'm carrying with me this entire storyline, and this resentment's building up, and next time I see that person, I immediately get the anger triggered again because I'm projecting this whole story when it was just an echo, the reality, right? There was just some sound vibration, some air particles moving, hit my ear, and then I let myself, right? This experience of anger came from the mind, right? A mind that was not being controlled by my best side. Instead, it was being controlled by my habits of projection and anger and only caring about myself as the center of the universe. So once you start getting more familiar with that experience of how anger is arising, right? I'm using anger as an example because we all experience it, and it's so destructive that it's really important to see how that works, and to try and reduce it, right? And to regulate it. So there are many other types of negative emotions that create. And when we say negative emotion, what we mean is just any kind of mental state. It doesn't even literally have to be an emotion. It could be a cognitive state even, but any mental state which causes a disturbance in the peace of your mind. Okay. So anger certainly does. I think the vast majority of us can agree on that. And when we say anger, that includes, right, aggravation, irritation. It includes all the way from just the little kind of underlying sense of dissatisfaction when you're waiting in line, getting a little impatient, all the way up to the hatred of my group versus their group, my country versus the enemy, and that motivates people to go and kill, all the way. That's all included under this one rubric of anger, right? So you see how that works, right? And then your question was,
right, or like what was it about the philosophy that helped you target these unreasonable states of mind,
Right.
like anger, for example. So what is it in Buddhist philosophy that were practical pieces of wisdom that help you harness?
Yeah. Well, so the first thing is to become aware that it's happening. And like I said, the first move you make is just recognizing that the mind is its own entity unto itself. Doesn't mean that it's like a substance out there somewhere that you could find if you had the right physical equipment to read some kind of special signal, some kind of special, for lack of better example, like electromagnetic, but mental magnetism, something not like that.
Yeah.
It's its own entity in the sense of just the subjective experience is something to be observed and investigated in its own right. So once you start to do that, you see it happening. Then you learn what the remedies, right? The ways of thinking. It's essentially what, people do in cognitive behavioral therapy. Now, I have no training in therapy, just have heard a little bit. So this isn't maybe I'm saying more than I really have understanding to say, but it seems to be close to what the practice of cognitive behavioral therapy does. But you just learn the therapeutic ways of thinking yourself from a teacher, from a book, text, and apply it in your own mind, right? Not necessarily needing a therapist to guide you through it, but having people who've practiced it before, done it before successfully, they wrote down their practices, their ways of training their minds, they give it to you. So what are the ways of training the mind? Well, essentially it all comes down to gaining the skill of dissecting the object of your anger, your frustration. We're still using anger as an example, but it applies in other areas when we're talking about excessive craving, whether we're talking about jealousy, whether we're talking, which is a type of anger itself.
Yes.
Talking about arrogance, or whether we're talking about simple miscognitions, misapprehension of something, which we call ignorance. Essentially, there are so many different kinds of specific mind training instructions. And when we say, again, mind training, it means really ways of reframing your cognitive appraisals, right? In other words, cognitive reframing of what you're apprehending or what you're appraising. Okay, so let's say, for instance, I'm waiting in traffic. There's a car accident in front of me, right? The mind, right? The habits of irritation start ticking, ticking, ticking. Oh, that person was so dumb. Why did they get in the accident? They were probably speeding. Oh, I have to get to my meeting. Oh, I'm going to be so embarrassed. I'm going to make everyone wait for me. They're all going to hate me. Then I'm going to maybe lose my job. And, okay. And you build up the anger. Maybe there's another car, who kind of, how sometimes, I don't know, India is completely different. Anyway, in the States, cars, when there's a traffic jam, sometimes like go on the shoulder, and sort of, which is like you're not really supposed to do, and pass all the other cars waiting. So you see the car going up the shoulder. Oh, that person's so disrespectful, so inconsiderate. We're all waiting here. Everyone's in the same position, and they just think they're the king of the world, that they can just go up. Okay, so what are we doing? We're getting angry because of our thoughts, right? The way we're cognitively appraising the situation. So dissecting it would be something like, and there's many specific instructions, but just to give a simple one. So we look at the person who got in the accident and we recognize, hey, they also, had many different conditions that led to this situation. It wasn't like they woke up in the morning and said, oh, you know what's going to be great? If I got in a car accident today to make everyone on the highway have to wait for an hour, No, of course not. First of all, they're suffering. They might even be, frankly, they may be dead. They may be really injured, right? We don't know. So starting to think of compassion for the person, right? Just, in other words, expanding your recognition of all the different facets of a situation that you're perceiving. They actually are really not like the reaction of anger is not at all appropriate. Instead, compassion is really the more realistic reaction.
So compassion is what opens up your perspective to allow for all the other conditions that may have led to the situation that's causing your mind's upheaval.
Yeah, essentially it's compassion. That's the main one. But even other things, just in a sense, just being realistic in how you approach, with your thoughts, how you approach the situation, recognizing there were many other conditions, right? Maybe someone cut them off, maybe there was a weather condition, maybe their car failed, right? Maybe they are just a bad driver and just weren't looking or watching their phone or something. But then even that, it's not like they intentionally got in an accident. It's some condition that they weren't expecting, they didn't want, and it led to this accident. And so yes, essentially compassion is the main runner, right? The main fuel behind this whole process, because in order to even want to do it, right? In order to even want to change your mind and get rid of your anger, you have to already have some sense that not only do I, want myself to be happy, but others also are in the same position. They want to be happy too. No one wants to suffer. And so just by opening up your awareness to that fundamental, basic reality that all people want to be happy, then you can start considering more, right? You can start considering their situation more. And then that acts as an antidote to anger. When someone yells, hey, F you, they're being controlled by their own anger. They're being controlled by their negative emotions.
Right.
So what's the real source of it all? It's their negative emotions.
Yeah.
So it doesn't make any sense to actually hate the person, right? What we should do is recognize that all of our problems are coming from the negative emotions that are causing others to harm us, causing us to get angry at them. So that's the fundamental enemy, right? Not other human beings.
Fantastic.
We're all being, what to say, taken advantage of by negative emotions.
So what is the Buddhist mental model or practice or technique to be so aware of not just your mental state, but also to have that empathy and compassion, to be aware that your actions are being determined by your emotional state? There's got to be something that helps train you to see things from this perspective.
Yeah, it's learning. We have to actually learn, right, how the mind functions. So that is the whole topic of the whole entire 2,500-year history of Buddhist philosophy and psychology, essentially, right? Actually, Buddhism focuses more on psychology than we're to use sort of a general discipline to describe what the Buddhist explanations or teachings actually are focused on. It's mostly psychology, right? So learning how the mind functions. So we talk about there's 3 levels of learning that occur. And this isn't only like when learning spiritual practice or Buddhist teaching. This is 3 levels of learning that occur with regard to anything. It's just, again, it comes from the Nalanda tradition, from the Buddhist tradition, that we have this recognition, but it's basic to everything. But it's also understanding it helps you to become more, in a word, structured in how you approach your study and spiritual practice. So those 3 levels are the first level is the level that comes from external sources. So learning from external sources is number 1. Then number 2 is the learning that comes from internalizing, right? Making this knowledge not just some external words you heard from a teacher or read in a book, but actually making it a deep conviction based on logic, based on reasoning, based on a thorough understanding of the topic, right? And that gives rise to this new state of knowledge, right? The second level of learning that arises from internalizing. And then the third level of knowledge is the one that arises from continuous training. Okay, so this means meditational training now. So this is something that is generally in the wider world not done outside of spiritual practices, right? Now, in terms of learning about the mind and how to regulate your emotions, this comes by first, again, learning from external sources, which we do by reading and attending lectures the same way the cell biologist does. Yeah. And then instead of looking at something under a microscope as a physical tool, a scientific instrument, we use the scientific instrument of our own observational powers as a person with a mind, as a being with a mind. We also have the ability to observe our mind, right? So that means that we sit and reflect. We also use the powerful tool of Nalanda debate. So debate means now you're not using just one mind, now you're using two minds. Your mind plus another. Of course, the age-old saying of two minds are better than one, two heads are better than one. Yeah. So this is exactly what we the basic understanding for why we do this practice of debate. You get together with a classmate, with a partner, and then you start analyzing. Oh, so when I'm getting angry at someone, is it really just 100% projection? Is there really no external enemy there whatsoever? So you analyze and you look at, you don't have to go into the full debate structure, but you would take specific situations, look at what is happening, like what is the nature of that person, what is the nature of in other words, the trigger of the anger, what's the nature of the anger, where is the anger coming from, how does it arise? And this brings conviction, this brings the kind of personal experience that you now have, and you don't need to look at a book anymore. You know what anger is, you know how to deal with it. Then the training. So the training is when you actually sit and single-pointedly allow your entire mind to absorb. Your entire experience is just completely absorbed in this understanding of, let's say, compassion as, as an antidote or a remedy to anger. So you just absorb your mind completely in the wish that all sentient beings are free of suffering and the causes of suffering. After gaining the deeper understanding, then you have, a nuanced picture of it, and then you single-pointedly focus with all of your energy and attention. That becomes now part of you. Now you have this learning that came from training your mind in this deep, intensive, single-pointed concentration. It becomes like part of you. Yeah.
Right. How interesting. These layers of accessing the wisdom, really making it your own, testing it with your peers, and then you go in meditation and you really do it for the releasing of suffering of everyone around you, which was really the source of, what we were just now talking about. All of human suffering is related to our mind and our suffering of it.
Right, and that was in that example. That's if you're meditating on compassion, and that's. Yeah. But there's so many other things to meditate on. You can meditate on, again, through the three-part learning process. Start by listening to explanations, then analyzing, then meditating. But for instance, something like impermanence, right? Impermanence has two levels, but the subtlest level means the transitory, moment by moment.
I'm going to quickly interrupt you.
Yeah.
Why would someone want to learn about impermanence or study the concept of impermanence?
Sure. So why would someone want to learn about impermanence? Well, it's because one of the biggest... So like we were talking about negative emotions and how people are just controlled, right? We're being taken advantage of by our negative emotions. But what's at the root of all of it? The root of all of it is actually basic misapprehension of an object. In other words, misperceptions. What is another word for that? Ignorance. Ignorance. Now, the Buddha was very wise because even though there can be, infinite different specific kinds of misperceptions. Yeah. I could see someone walking by. I think it's, Sunam. They from the back it looks like Sunam. They turn around. Their face is completely different. And I realize it's not Sunam. So I had a misperception of the person walking by. Okay, you can have a misperception of so many different things, a visual thing, an audio thing. If someone said, a certain word, you heard something else, right?
Yes.
Right? Of course, visual, optical illusions, all these things. But the Buddha was very wise, and so he identified specifically 4 specific kinds of ignorance that really underlie all the other ones. And one of those is to see what is actually impermanent as permanent, or to grasp, to apprehend, perceive. To perceive what is actually in reality impermanent, to be permanent. So, why do we want to learn about impermanence? Because we have already this innate, almost ingrained by our biology and evolution, perception that impermanent things are permanent. In other words, we have a misperception that just came with us. Just came with us into this life. So we didn't necessarily learn that things are permanent.
Right.
But when I look at this table, I don't see that it's constantly undergoing incessant change in this cascade of, even though we can think about it and recognize through the knowledge that we've learned from the books, that it's composed of atoms, that it's composed of protons, that the atoms are composed of protons, neutrons, and electrons, and that we know that electrons, protons, and neutrons are undergoing incessant change, right? They don't abide in a fixed position. Okay, so even though we know that on one level, that's what level is that? Yeah. That's the level from external sources. So then we have to use more reasoning, dialogue, discussion, reflection to make it our own internalized experience. Okay, so why would we do that? Well, that's because now it gets into, okay, so anger is still there, but let's focus now on attachment or craving, okay? So this is another negative emotion because it disturbs the peace of mind. How does it disturb peace of mind?
Impermanence is the antidote for this attachment.
Right, understanding impermanence is the antidote to attachment, because the reason that we feel sad, loss, right, the pain of loss, okay, comes because we have an assumption or a perception that the thing that dies or gets destroyed, disintegrates, would last, right? That it would endure. When in reality, it's not going to endure. It's in the nature of impermanence, the nature of change. So we meet a friend, we have so much fun, we get along so well, we want to hang out with them again. The next time we hang out with them, they're acting completely different. They're drunk, they're high, they're just, they're just dozing off. They're like no fun at all, total bore, right? Or you meet a girl or a boy and you're so attracted to them, and then you actually start a relationship. After a few months, a year, you see different things that you didn't see before, okay? Or things go really well and you actually completely love them. They're your whole world. And then, remember that car accident from before? Well, your girlfriend was in the passenger seat and she's now dead, right? Sure. Not to laugh at someone dying, but it's the funny thing that we can laugh at is our stupidity for thinking that someone would be permanent, right? For believing that just because we like them means that they're going to always be there for us, when nothing will always be there for us. It's just not the nature of things. Sure. So why should we understand impermanence? Because it is the reality. And the reality is always going to be more reliable. Okay? Mm-hmm. The reality will be reliable because that's how things function, and our minds and our perceptions are in line with that. Then, when the person you love dies, you're going to not, of course, there'll still be sadness. It's just going to be different, right? Yeah. You'll still have emotion connection. You don't lose your emotional connection. Right. What you lose is that intense longing to never be separated that brings so much unnecessary pain. Okay? So then when someone passes, you instead of your thought going, how could this happen? They were so young. How could this happen? Your first thought will be, yes. All things that are born, all people that are born in the end die. One of the things the Buddha said. Everything that is gathered together will end in separation. Everything that is accumulated will end in being used up and exhausted. Everything that stands or goes high will end in falling and going low. Mm-hmm. Everything that is born ends in death.
Right. Yeah, it's a very powerful mental model to also rein in your expectations, right? So you may meet a person and have a great dinner with them, and the next day they may have had some intoxicant or a difficult breakfast with their wife, and they're not the same person. So your expectations are also checked that, you can't expect the same all the time.
Yeah, and this actually, so you might think now, well, so does that mean that your life just becomes completely empty and dry and pointless or meaningless? Actually, the opposite is true. So you have to think about why, right? Yeah. But if it's not that, it's a little perplexing, but it's like also makes tons of sense, right? Because when you actually are thinking, right, and you align your expectations, thoughts with the way things genuinely function, reality in other words, then you're able to really be there with people and see the actual unfolding of the moment-to-moment changes. So when that friend comes, instead of just saying, "Oh, I hate this person, they're so deceptive, they were acting one way and now they're different," instead you can say, "Oh, well, this person's a little different." Right.
Sure.
So what's going on with them? You can be interested, right? You can try and help them.
Yes.
You can be there for them, right? And even when the person you love dies, but if the whole time you know, as you're enjoying life with them, that they're going to die, then the whole time you're not preoccupied with this imaginary other world that that, again, it's all projection, this other world where we're always going to be together. Even when we die, we're going to heaven together. Like, instead, you're just there with the real person. You know? And there's actually much more joy there.
Yes, there's a different quality in experiencing that time with them.
Yes.
When you know it's impermanent, and it also takes, away the judgment, like you were saying earlier, that there's so much backstory we don't know of. At the same time, the lack of expectation of relationships to be the same over the years can be a really great solution, right, to so many of our conflicts. Really fascinating. So we talked about compassion as an antidote for anger and various other emotions, because it gives you a perspective on how things may appear to be the way they are in its full reality, but really you have a composition of so many other factors behind it, that if we were to zoom out and look at the big picture on things, what's making us anger or triggering our emotions really has a backstory that we should be more empathetic towards. And then we have the idea of impermanence as an antidote to attachment. And you explain that attachment is really how we cling on to situations and relationships and people and expecting them to be the same through eternity. And when that changes, it just rocks our emotional equilibrium. And what I find really fascinating is the understanding of emptiness in Buddhism, or the theory of emptiness in Buddhism. And I feel like there's some interconnection here between the idea of emptiness and impermanence and this composition of factors that we use to understand our reality in our very basic way. So I was wondering if you could maybe shed some light on what emptiness is and how it affects us.
Sure. So I gave a disclaimer about emptiness. Not everyone is actually ready, in some sense, to think about or understand emptiness, right? If you have a very strong perception that things are unchangeable, that things are sort of locked into their specific set of qualities that are just this kind of tightly contained box, and that's how you think of things, then it's better not to think about emptiness, right? You have to have some openness to the possibility of things being less tangible than they seem. The other thing I want to say just about compassion, since you brought it up, is just to add one thing, that really about compassion, the most important thing to understand is that every single human being on the planet, right, came out of the womb of their mother, okay? Or at least from the egg of their mother, okay? And that means that we all receive the natural love that comes from a mother, the love and compassion, okay? And then as we grew up, even if we weren't cared for by our biological mother, we were cared for by someone. If we weren't, we wouldn't be alive. Okay? So we were cared for by someone who gave us food, who gave us love, who gave us attention, affection. All of that means that our basic nature of how we just came to be where we are today, right, is completely 100%, right, swimming in a pool of compassion. This is closer to our basic nature. It's what sustains human beings. And if you just take a few minutes to think about, how, anything that you have, that you enjoy, any part of your life came to you, If you're sitting in a room on a chair with a table in front of you, with a computer or phone or a tablet, all the technology, all this came because of the efforts, collective efforts of, countless people. As soon as you start to think about it, it becomes beyond the ability of us to even count how many people were involved in bringing us the basic joys of life. So that's another reason why compassion is the appropriate and realistic attitude to have towards others. Okay. Compassion is done for now. You can always come back to it. So emptiness. Okay. So emptiness is the actual nature of all existent things. Okay. If it's something that exists, then it is necessarily empty of an intrinsic nature. Why is this important to understand? Well, again, when we were talking about impermanence, it's the same idea. Just the fact of having your expectations and your thoughts align with reality means that your understanding of things and expectations of things will be reliable, right? You're not going to be deceived by the actualities that unfold, right? If we don't see things in line with reality, then when events unfold in reality, we're going to be disappointed, upset, confused, right?
Yes.
So that's one thing. The other thing is that the basic conception, so now this applies to ourselves. Now we get into the question of a self. Who are we, right? Who am I? The self, the me, the person. That is the center point of my entire, right, lifetime of experiences and interests, my aspirations, my ambitions, my relationships. They're all centered around the me, the I. I'm saying my perceptions, my mind, my body. It's because there's an I here. There's a person. So the nature of the person becomes an important question too. So the nature of the person and the nature of non-person things, or non-person things, a table, a chair, all matter. All matter is non-person things, material objects. And then minds, consciousness, emotions, those are non-persons. Right. The person's one kind of phenomenon or object, existent thing, and everything else is a non-person. So each of them, every single one of those things I just mentioned, okay, everything you can conceive of that's existent, okay, has the same nature of lacking an intrinsic nature. Now, what does it mean to have an intrinsic nature? What would it mean? It doesn't mean anything because there are no things with intrinsic natures. What would it mean? What is the perception? What is the assumption that things have intrinsic natures? Well, it's the assumption that there exists, let's just say myself, okay? There exists a person in here who is independent. In other words, a self-sustaining, self-contained entity. I am something that can decide for myself what to do with my life. I can take control of the situation and be in charge. I can become the leader of the country, the leader of the world. It's this sense that there's an I which is self-contained, and the word we use is intrinsically existent, right? Intrinsically has its own nature. So when you see the table, it just appears to be one independent object with an intrinsic nature as table. But then you ask, but let's go closer and ask, where is it really? Where does it lie within its parts? Right? When you analyze one by one, now you're making what? An analysis of the ultimate nature of the table. As soon as you start to make an analysis of the ultimate nature of the table, what is it really? Where is it really? Yeah. Okay? Then all you see are different parts. You actually can't identify a table anymore. Now, as soon as you start to do this, you say, oh, there's no table on the top. It's not in the atoms that make up the paint. It's not in the wood fibers. It's not in the legs. It's not in the right front leg. It's not in the back left leg. So what happens? The very notion of table dissolves. That's the emptiness of a table.
So you're saying that what we generally perceive as an independent, solid object that we have a definite concept of, when we go deeper into trying to understand what makes it what it is, that's when the concept dissolves.
Right. We recognize that the very notion of table is a naive, or it's a naive notion. The notion of table it's a convention only. It's merely a convention. Yeah? And this is understood easier with the simple analogy, simple example of having a misperception of a mirage as water, right? Even if you maybe haven't had an experience of a mirage, we all know, at least from movies or from descriptions, it's hot, there's a flat area, long distance that you can see, sun's beating down, there's some kind of shimmering that looks like water. You really believe there's water. You're very thirsty, so you believe there's water over there. Now, if this is straight from the Garjuna, in the text called the Precious Garland, and so the precious garland of the middle way. And so he says, if the mirage were water, then why do those close by not see water? So as soon as you go closer, or you see your friend down there, you go, hey, can you bring me back some water? Your friend's right there where you see the mirage water, and they go, nothing here. Sorry, there's no water. You're hallucinating, right? You're hallucinating. So this is the idea. As soon as we take a closer analysis, right, towards an object, even something as solid as a table, as solid as a building, a house, our own bodies, or ourself, the self that I talked about, right? As soon as we take a closer examination, then that naive notion just fades away. And we find the emptiness.
Interesting. And this, just at a more superficial level, it reminds me of what you said about the person cutting you off in traffic.
Right.
Right?
That's exactly right. Go ahead.
Yeah, please.
But that's exactly right, because what I was saying there, I was using a type of analysis of the ultimate nature of that person, right, and that situation, as an antidote to anger. But the reality is, it's an antidote essentially to the root of the anger, which is ignorance, the misperception that things are, that are in some sense in and of themselves a reality. And when we say in and of themselves, what that really leads to, and this takes a little bit of other explanation or other reflections, but it really leads to a belief or perception that things are independent of your mind. So the reality is that things are dependent on your mind, in the sense that they're dependent on how we perceive them, right? They're dependent, things that exist only in relation to how they're perceived by living beings, right? So that's why, right, if we do this kind of analysis of the ultimate nature of something, and we can see that, oh, the table as it exists, as it appears, the table as I think with my naive concept, notion, that just exists this way because it's appearing, meaning being experienced as a table, as this single object that I can go to the store and buy and ask this carpenter to build. And as soon as you have the belief or the apprehension, cognitive appraisal, if you will, all meaning the same thing. So if you have a cognitive appraisal that the table genuinely exists that way, cut off from my consciousness, it's not related to my consciousness. If you believe it's just its own independent entity, intrinsic entity or nature, then it gets burned in a fire and you feel sad. You feel the loss, right? Someone steals it and you feel a bit upset, the anger, right? It gets paint dripped on it or ink dripped on it and it gets stained. As soon as you recognize that from the very get-go, it only existed in relation to my own perception of it, there's just this, and it's hard to describe without each person individually doing your own reflection to get some sense and feeling for this. But you'll see, if you do, there's this incredible freedom that opens up in your mind.
Amazing. How powerful.
Incredible freedom. Why?
Yes.
Because now you recognize, oh, there's paint that's spilled on it, but there's no objectively existent table there to begin with. Objective as meaning separate from my mind.
Sure.
So now it's just a changing entity, sure. Right? I can still go and do the ultimate analysis, recognize that there's nothing there to be truly identified, that you can genuinely put your finger on and say, that's the table that I love so much, that I paid 10,000 rupees for, that I want to last for a long time. You can't put your finger on anything within the table itself, right? You do this analysis of the causes, you do an analysis of how it was produced, you do analysis of relation to its parts. Like I said, there's hundreds of different ways to analyze, but those are just two examples. Then there's just freedom.
So yeah, that's also something really fascinating about Buddhism, is the various schools of Buddhism.
Yeah.
And how they differ from each other. And you're immersed in Tibetan Buddhism in particular.
Yes.
And the Mahayana tradition.
Right.
And it would be really interesting to understand what is the Mahayana tradition in relationship to the other schools of Buddhism.
Sure.
Let's start there.
Well, it's a complex and a little bit of a thorny question, because, like anything, if you really learn about the complexities of something, there are many different perspectives with which you can look at it, okay? There's a historical perspective, there's a philosophical perspective, there's a contemporary sort of living traditions perspective, okay? So if we just look historically, and we just go from the perspective of the Tibetan tradition itself, okay? What happened was, the Buddha was born in about 583 BC in what's today Nepal, Lumbini, and spent most of his teaching career, became enlightened at the age of 36, and then spent his career the next 45 years teaching. At the age of 35, he taught for 45 years until passed at the age of 80, mostly in India, right? Throughout northern India, essentially. At that time, he taught many different things. So the beauty of the Buddha is that since he was enlightened, awakened, he understood the various needs and interests, the different dispositions, ways of thinking of every person that he encountered. He understood their mind fully, right? Because his compassion was completely awakened, completely evolved, and his wisdom also. If he encountered a person that, for instance, like I said, the warning about emptiness, not everyone's ready to hear it. If he encountered a person that wasn't ready to hear about emptiness, he wasn't going to teach them about it. Instead, he would just talk about the impermanence of the table. He wouldn't say, do the ultimate analysis where you really look for the table and then don't find it, because that person might get too scared, right? Some people might get so scared that they think nothing is real. Everything is just an illusion. There's no reason to go about life. All is meaningless, and then not do any, kind actions and contribute to the world and make the world a better place. They might just, go crazy or start killing people, killing meaning is become hedonistic, essentially, right? Thinking nothing really matters. I might as well just enjoy pleasure. Okay. Something like that. So the Buddha taught to that kind of person that things do exist objectively, apart from the mind. Okay? So some schools believe that, right? Then also, the Buddha taught to those who were ready to hear emptiness, he taught about emptiness. To some people, the Buddha taught a path for how to actually become a Buddha, like himself. In other words, generate this infinite compassion that holds every single sentient being with the equal amount of loving care and is dedicated to working for each and every living being's welfare. That's called the path of the Bodhisattvas, the Bodhisattva Yana, the Bodhisattva vehicle. Yeah. To some people, he recognized that's just too vast of a way of thinking. It's going to become overwhelming for them. They can't handle it, right? So instead, he taught, this is how you can achieve personal liberation, okay? By doing this set of practices. You don't have to necessarily think about bringing all living beings with you. That's just too much to think about. You can't comprehend infinite sentient beings, right? Yeah. So do these other practices, and you can still become liberated from suffering, from the causes of suffering. The Buddha taught all of this throughout his 45 years teaching. After he passed away, and there's also many different specific philosophical points that he taught, and again, these kind of came to become different philosophical traditions. even completely different paradigms of reality. Now, when we say, just as a side note, well, it's connected, but kind of a side note, that there's different paradigms of Buddhist philosophy. They're all still within the basic structure. Just like there's different scientific paradigms, Newtonian physics and quantum mechanics, there's still some commonality that stretches that's a thread through them. Likewise, commonality through the thread of all the Buddhist traditions is, to accept that the Buddha is the teacher who explains the refuge which protects us from suffering. The Dharma is the actual protection from suffering or refuge from suffering. And then the Sangha is like the community of practitioners who have already achieved higher states of achievement and can assist us to achieve the final result of freedom. Okay, freedom from suffering. So those are called the three jewels, the Triratna, right? Okay, so that's common to all Buddhist traditions, accepting that those are genuinely going to lead you to freedom from suffering, happiness. And then understanding of karma, understanding of previous and future lives, common to all the paradigms within Buddhism. Okay, so just those are some of the common themes, even though there are some vastly different aspects as well.
So Nagarjuna arose 600 years after Buddha passed.
That's right. So Nagarjuna came into the world, and he was predicted by the Buddha in one of the sutras, and he was born in South India, and he became a scholar of Buddhism, and then he actually was able to reveal all these different sutras that the Buddha taught, but that were basically hidden away. And these are called the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, or the Prajnaparamita Sutras. So today, in all the Mahayana Buddhist cultures of the world, you see the practice done on a daily basis, everywhere, of reciting the Heart Sutra. So the Heart Sutra is a Prajnaparamita Sutra, a Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. So those were rediscovered by Nagarjuna. But then on top of that, Nagarjuna made the presentation or understanding, right, the theories of the Mahayana practices extremely clear. And he really, wrote many texts that were so detailed about how to do the Bodhisattva practices, practicing the sixth perfection: generosity, ethical conduct, patience, joyous effort, concentration, wisdom, how to especially understand emptiness and generate what's called the bodhicitta, what I mentioned before, right? This mind that is motivated by compassion, but is really focused on achieving the aim of complete enlightenment, complete awakening. So he wrote texts that covered all these different topics, and then including the standard or common practices, generating powerful mindfulness, concentration, basic, there's so many different, common shared practices, but the ones that are unique to what we call the Mahayana tradition are this bodhicitta, to oneself take on the responsibility to become awakened for the welfare of all living beings as a practitioner of Buddhism, and then the understanding of this ultimate nature of all phenomena, emptiness.
Emptiness,
Yeah.
Okay. Fascinating.
So Nagarjuna's specialty was those two things. And then...
And that's
so we
what the
could say-
Mahayana tradition adopted.
And so he became essentially the founder of the Mahayana tradition, for lack of a better word.
Okay.
The Buddha was actually the founder, but because it wasn't really carried on for several hundred years, and that's a long time when you really think about it. I mean, come on, can we really think about like someone coming along today and then for 600 years, some teaching they gave, or some let's say some scientist discovers some new method for nuclear fusion, and it just kind of like gets locked into some archive somewhere for 600 years. Like, that's
incredible. Yes, exactly.
That's sort of what happens, right?
Yes. The Mahayana tradition, just to sum up, bodhicitta, or the idea of awakening for the benefit of all creatures, as opposed to awakening for your personal enlightenment, which is likely what another school believes in or follows.
Right. The non-Mahayana traditions, they focus on what's called nirvana, achievement of nirvana, which is like one's own liberation from the uncontrolled cycle of repeatedly taking birth in an uncontrolled environment where you encounter various forms of suffering, infinite miseries.
Which is that school that is more about nirvana?
So I think the general term used today is Theravada. Okay. But I won't promise that that's the only valid term to use or the only school to think about. Yeah. but generally, right, the community of whatever, Buddhist scholars or Buddhist interested people divides the Buddhist world into the Theravada and the Mahayana, generally.
Okay, and then all the other schools stem out of the Mahayana tradition?
Well, all the schools would be included in one of those two camps,
In one
right?
of those two big camps.
Right, right. So there's various types of Thai traditions, but there's a lot of overlap too, because history is history, right?
Sure.
People moved, people gave rise to different beliefs, different traditions and practices, right? So it's not that clear cut. You know, if you go to Thailand, you see people practicing very similar or the same as what they practice in China or other Mahayana countries, you know. So, but generally, right, the Theravada countries, just to give like so I'm giving so much, you know, disclaimer or what have you, because
just generalizations.
Yeah, generalizations aren't necessarily that helpful, but just you know, for basic, to be in line with a basic understanding.
Yeah.
So the Theravada countries include Thailand, Burma, Sri Lanka, Laos, Cambodia, parts of Vietnam, and parts of Nepal.
Okay.
Mahayana includes China, Mongolia, and you could say the Himalayan regions. So that includes Mongolia, Tibet, Bhutan, parts of Nepal, parts of northern India, like Ladakh, Tawang, okay, Sikkim. Those are all the Himalayan Buddhist areas. And then you have Vietnam, Korea, Japan, Taiwan.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, those are the Mahayana Buddhists. And then where does that leave modern day India and the West, Europe and America and South America? You know, I don't know. It's a mishmash of everything, I guess.
Exactly. That's okay. So the Mahayana tradition has, basically adopted a lot of what Nagarjuna rediscovered.
Everything, yeah.
Everything.
That's the Mahayana tradition came from Nagarjuna. You know, some even Tibetan scholars will say, maybe it's not a popular way to say it, but we'll even say, like, actually the Theravada countries, the ones that focus on what we call the Pali canon, just because their main body of literature was written down in the Pali language, even though it was actually composed and, collected and written down in the country of Sri Lanka, it was done in an Indian language, Pali. Okay, and several hundred years after the Buddha had passed already, I think in 3rd century AD. And don't quote me on the exact date. Well, I didn't give an exact date. Don't quote me on the rough date. Something like that.
Sure.
I'm not a historian. And then the Mahayana tradition also can be called the Sanskrit tradition, because the basic corpus of the basic literature was written down in the Sanskrit language. So those countries that focus on the Pali literature, the Theravada countries, some will say, even Tibetan scholars, that they're actually the ones who are really following like the core Buddhist teachings, right? Whereas the Mahayana traditions really were, founded by Nagarjuna. So there was sort of like this elaboration, or, not elaboration as, newly creating, but just really going deeply into the meaning of what the Buddha had taught and expounding on it in more detail, right? So there was this sort of elaboration that Nagarjuna made for the Mahayana traditions. So, so that's one way to think of it. So again, it's a recognition, just saying this because it's important for people to know that the Mahayana practitioners and people who follow the tradition themselves do have self-awareness that there was this gap between, so if you're looking historically and you say, if people say the Mahayana teachings aren't from the Buddha because they weren't, passed down or widely recognized at the time of the Buddha, that means they came later. We recognize that, yes. We're just saying that they actually were taught by the Buddha. It's just that they weren't popularized or weren't that common for several hundred years until Nagarjuna came along. Yeah.
How fascinating. I think the one thing about Buddhism that really resonates is so much of the teachings are...
Wait, can I add one thing?
Yes,
so
please,
the other thing, just to add about the importance or uniqueness, I should say. The one thing to add about the uniqueness of the Mahayana tradition is, in addition to bodhicitta, the teaching of emptiness, which what makes it unique, different from the Pali literature or the Theravada practitioners, is that they focus more, and they meaning those texts as well as those practitioners, they focus more on a recognition of the selflessness of the person. So you would do a reflection through the 3 types of learning that we went through, the three-part process of learning, to recognize that there is no independent, right, substantially existent or autonomous self anywhere within me or outside of me that could somehow be called like a soul or an atman, that somehow the controller, like the free will that takes everything under its, power and control. No, there's just these, right, constantly changing processes, body and mind. Now, the addition that the Nagarjuna and, of course, the Buddha himself, but more detailed, Nagarjuna adds on top, is that not only is it the person that's empty in this way of itself, all phenomena are empty in the same way. There is no autonomous, objective reality in anything.
So we have Buddhism's fundamentals that are based on things that may sound really intuitive, things like compassion, generosity, wisdom. And these are things that are almost second nature to us, and they're easy to adopt. It's easy to be a secular person and adopt a lot of the teachings of Buddhism. And then you have a whole other school of Buddhism, which is so shrouded in mystery and potential ritual, and which I understand is the Vajrayana school of Buddhism. I'm curious to know a little bit more about that. What is it all about?
I don't know much about the Vajrayana practices or teachings. I would just say, yes, just because you raised interesting and important points there. Yes. Essentially, why are we calling this the Nalanda tradition? Because it is not something that is unique to a particular faith. It's something that is by nature secular, right? This teaching of emptiness and bodhicitta, these practices for emotion regulation and becoming aware of your own mind, mental processes, they're secular. They were taught by someone who's called the Buddha. The culture of people that developed after the Buddha taught those things, right? Then, and even while the Buddha was alive still, but it became this whole world unto itself, a whole society or culture unto itself, right? A substream of society that included a lot of different practices and rituals, as you say, which, gives, again, from the naive sense of just kind of looking at it from far away, the person looking at the mirage, that this is a religion of some sort. Okay? There are religious components. Okay? Leave them. Take the components that help you become a kinder person. Take the components that help you become a happier person. Have more peace of mind. Have more sense of self-understanding. Okay? That's fine. So by nature, these teachings, they are secular. There's no need to accept anything blindly, any dogma, have any faith even. You can verify everything that the Buddha taught through your own reasoning and experience. As the Buddha himself said. What did the Buddha say? He said, my teachings, he said, all of my followers and all of the scholars, my teachings are not to be accepted out of respect in me, but are to be accepted in the same way that a goldsmith or someone who is assaying gold to test its purity, right, would test it by burning, cutting, and rubbing it. Okay, so that's how the Buddhist teachings, by his own word, are to be analyzed. So it's very different from what the rest of the world religious traditions claim or teach. Encourage the disciples to do. Most of them do what? They encourage their disciples to believe, hallelujah, praise the Lord. No. You don't need the hallelujah. Even though it is exciting, it is wonderful, when you start thinking about bodhicitta and giving rise to this kind of mind that holds all living beings with great love, it is like hallelujah, but that's because it's just a powerful mental state that you're learning to develop.
Yes.
Okay, so Vajrayana, I don't know much about it. But essentially what it is a subset of the Mahayana. So it actually only works, right? The Vajrayana teachings and practices only work, right? The meditations only work if you already have understanding of emptiness and you've developed a strong bodhicitta, a strong habit of bodhicitta. Okay, otherwise, they're not going to bring you to the result. What's the result? Full awakening. So the Tantrayana or Vajrayana teachings were taught in order to speed up the process to become fully awakened. And they relate, in the teachings in general, give a very general explanation, they relate with using different types of visualization to change one's self-perception, as well as, again, all based on the already understanding that I'm not an intrinsic, there's no intrinsic nature to me, to the self. So then you use different kind of creative visualizations to, the practitioner would transform their self-perception through various meditations, and then using visualization, as well as at a more advanced level, actually directly working with different subtle aspects of what's called the subtle body. So this is something that the wider Buddhist teachings or the more general Buddhist teachings don't really approach or address. But there's then becomes this a whole different way of theorizing or understanding subtle energies within the body, essentially. Okay, so there's working with these subtle energies, as you might know, the Sanskrit or Indian terms, right? The nadis, bindus, chakras, things like that, right?
Interesting.
Yeah. We say the channels, winds, and drops in English.
Understood. So now just to wrap up and back to a bit more of the secular spirit of Buddhism, and in particular just zoning in on the Bodhisattva ideals, right? So what can the everyday person do to embody those Bodhisattva ideals? What is firstly, I guess maybe just a brief on what is the secular interpretation of Bodhisattva, and how can an everyday person take those principles and embody them?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So what is the secular interpretation of the Bodhisattva ideal? Well, it's to devote every moment of your waking and sleeping life to serving the entire world without any division, okay? It's to recognizing that we are one human family, essentially, right? I'm going to do what I can today, in this very act, in this very moment, on this very day, to help preserve the environment so that we don't destroy the planet, for other human beings, for other animals, to help care for my neighbors, care for my family, to genuinely respect others, right? Respect their perspectives, respect their needs, have love, improve. I mean, the practices of meditating on loving kindness and compassion doesn't change because it is by nature secular. There's nothing religious about it. You don't have to accept any belief system to recognize that every single person that you ever meet, ever have met, and will meet just wishes to have happiness and does not want to suffer. So generating the attitude, right? Now, what might make it feel or appear, if we don't think about it carefully with wisdom, what may make it appear to be not secular or something different is simply that, well, it takes a training of the mind. And so in secular society, there's not much of a tradition of training of the mind.
Yes.
That's just a flaw of secular society. It doesn't mean that training your mind is a religious or inherently non-secular activity, right? So we still have to sit and kind of focus the mind in, right? Focus on your breathing for 5 minutes to calm and settle the mind, and then start thinking of other living beings and wishing them happiness, right? It's simple as this. May all living beings experience happiness and the causes of happiness. I will devote myself and my energies to enabling all living beings to have happiness and the causes of happiness, right? And sit with that way of thinking. That changes your emotions. That brings loving kindness.
That's so inspiring, and we could all use so much of that. Thank you so much for sharing. And if there's anyone listening that can support your work, maybe you can give a couple of minutes and tell us a bit about your activities, what you're doing within the realm of Tibetan Buddhism, and how people can participate or support.
Okay. The most important thing you can do to support is to just do that for 5 minutes, what I just said. Okay, so sit down and think about your neighbors, your family members, the people you went to school with, and generate this state of loving kindness towards them. If you do that for literally 10 seconds, that's more valuable than any website you visit or any offering or donation you could ever make. Okay? So please do that. If you really want to try and find out things that I'm involved in, there's a couple. So one, I'm actually involved in starting a new monastery in the USA in the state of Connecticut. It's called Forest of Wisdom, and the website is www.forestofwisdom.love. L-O-V-E. Okay? So not .com.
Forestofwisdom.love.
.love, L-O-V-E.
Amazing. Okay. Yes.
And there's information about the monastery there, and you can and then the way to donate should be on that website. And that is just starting. So literally, we are just bringing over a teacher from India, which we're still in the process of requesting the visa. So it's going to be a few months before there's even teachings there. But there is, a place that people can come to, and will be active very soon by this fall, right, 2024. And then debate school is something I'm involved in. So there's a practice we didn't actually have time to get into, but we did a little bit, right? I mentioned it. So there's this practice that we use of Nalanda debate, which is the way that, like I said, we generate the second level of learning, of internalizing what we hear and study. And it's a kind of one-on-one practice that takes some training in. So we have a debate school to train people in English. Yeah, how to use this practice.
Yeah.
Because, it's never been done in English.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, there's little pockets of some exceptional teachers who are fluent in English or maybe from the West and have learned this great tradition of logic and debate from the Tibetans. But it hasn't really taken root. There's been just small pockets here and there. So we're trying to help it take root in the wider world, throughout India, throughout Western countries, in the English language, and especially in academic communities, because it's so powerful. It's not just useful for personal spiritual practice, but it's very, very useful for just analyzing scientific concepts, any philosophical concepts, right? Just getting clearer and clearer and clearer about the ideas that we are asserting or believing, and you could use it to analyze, the data you get from a scientific experiment to more clearly understand what they imply by using this kind of logical system of debate. So it's a specific format. We have classes in it. There's classes online. There's classes in person. The main thing that we're doing now is a 1-month intensive workshop once per year. So we'll have the next one in February of 2025. And you can learn more about it by visiting www.debateschool.org.
Debateschool.org.
Yes, and that's through a collaboration of Sera Jey Monastery in Karnataka, India, the Lama Tsongkhapa Institute in Palmaio, Italy, and the Italian Buddhist Union. So it's a collaboration of those three organizations that are making this debate school programs happen.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks again, Losang. It's been
Okay,
a fascinating
thank you, Shunya.
conversation.
By the way, your name means empty, right?
Yes, I do. Yes. Yeah, exactly. I'm nothing. Great. Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
Yes, I'm looking forward to maybe another conversation soon. Thanks.
Would be good. Okay. Take care.